Support your fruity friends, right? It gets better. Can you see it? You know, the funny thing about living in the present day is that it seems more and more that people desperately want to go back to the past. I mean, think about it. Diet culture is on the rise. The waistbands of our jeans are at an all-time low. Even our political climate has regressed back to 1984. Wink. So while we're revisiting the good old days for better, and mostly for worse, I thought it would be fun to revisit the genre that dominated the 2010s, that being dystopian. Arguably, ever since the publication of The Hunger Games in 2008, publishers have flooded bookstores all across the world with anything that they could slap a dystopian fiction label to. So I thought it would be fun to review some of the biggest teen dystopian novels of my childhood and see if they stand up to the test of time. In this video, I will be identifying what makes each of these books stand out, what they got right and what they got wrong, and if they can even be qualified as dystopian. The topic of dystopian novels will become more relevant as, once again, this genre is on the rise and is definitely not a recession indicator and does not speak to our greater socio-political climate. But without further ado, hello, welcome back. It is a new day, a new sleigh, and a new video where I have something to say. And today I will be reviewing one of the biggest teen novels, Divergent. So just as a breakdown, I plan on reviewing 3 novels. Starting with Divergent, I will then move on to The Maze Runner, and finally, The Hunger Games, because you can't talk about dystopian without talking about The Hunger Games. Those two go hand in hand. With that being said, I will also only be reviewing the first book in each respective series. But anyway, with all that out of the way, let's get into a spoiler-free summary of Divergent. I know that's probably crazy to say. Everyone has read Divergent. I don't need to say this summary, but I'm gonna do it anyway. So Divergent, here it is the first book in the Divergent series. This book follows our main character, who is Beatrice Pryor. She lives in a dystopian post-apocalyptic downtown Chicago. In this world, everyone is divided into one of 5 factions, that being abnegation, erudite, amity, candor, and dauntless. Beatrice, her brother Caleb, and every other 16-year-old in this world has to take their aptitude test to figure out which faction they should go to. For our main character, Beatrice, aka just Triss, she gets her results back and they are inconclusive. She finds out that she is divergent, meaning she doesn't fit into just one faction. So the book follows her initiation as she eventually chooses dauntless, and just overall her shenanigans with being a divergent. So in recent years, the conversation around Divergent has shifted dramatically. What was once a beloved franchise is now being looked at with a new light. Mostly this has been in conversation with the movie franchise, which don't even talk to me about Insurgent and Allegiant, that straight to DVD catastrophe. And while there is a conversation to be had about the script and the overall direction that they chose for the movie franchise, I think there is still something to be said about the source material. After rereading Divergent, I think I found the real reason why it falls flat in comparison to other successful dystopian franchises. And that reason is Divergent is actually a Christian fiction novel. Now, first and foremost, I don't have any problems with Christian fiction. Am I religious? No. Do I have any problem with anyone who is religious? Also, no. The reason I bring up religion as a quote-unquote issue is because in this instance, the religious aspect is a disadvantage to the story. If you look up, for example, Christian films on the internet, the consensus seems to be that they're just not very good. Most of the time, they're incredibly low-budget films, the acting isn't great, and more often than not, it's not so much a movie as it is a sermon. The main issue with including religion in things like movies and books is that that form of media is entirely dependent on storytelling. If you sit down to watch a movie or read a book or engage in any kind of visual media, you're doing so for entertainment. You are looking for a story. Now, that's not to say that church can't be a place of entertainment or that religious stories can't also be good. But what distinguishes good and bad Christian media is what they prioritize. Let's take an example from one of the best Christian films of all time, hands down, no argument. Even if you aren't religious, you know what this is. The Prince of Egypt. Now, The Prince of Egypt is based on a story from the Bible, and while there are teachings from God and other underlying messages relating to Christian faith, the purpose of that movie isn't to convert you. The movie tells a story. It gives life and color to the characters of the Bible. Even looking at our protagonist of the film, Moses, he is an incredibly complex character. Even though he is a religious figure and he becomes the object of praise at the end of the movie, he is initially not introduced as a likable character. The movie portrays him as someone who has moments of cruelty, arrogance, and selfishness.
I knew you cared about our freedom.
Miriam, freedom? Why would I care about that?
But over the span of the movie, he goes on a journey and he has a very clear character arc. And make no mistake, even if you aren't Christian or of any religious affiliation, this movie stands clearly in the memories of so many people. And that's part of the reason why the movie was so successful. This movie prioritized the art of storytelling, creating an iconic piece of media that leaves a lasting impression in the hearts of people in and outside the faith. Now, what does this have to do with Divergent, you might be asking? Well, that's because Divergent is actually a story about religious persecution. Now, you might think this is a stretch because surely this book that you read when you were a kid and you remember so vividly in your mind had no references to God or the Bible or any other religious teachings, right? Well, that's what I thought too. But then I reread it as an adult. And certain things started to stand out. At first, it was just weird little inklings. Certain things just stuck out to me and I couldn't quite put my finger on why. But then I read this quote in the book and everything clicked into place. On page 429 of the book, almost at the very end, this is the point where our main character Triss has already been captured by Erudite. This is the big climax of the story, the big confrontation scene, and she is talking to Janine, our main antagonist. So throughout the book, the main opposing powers are between Abnegation and Erudite. Abnegation is the faction that Triss came from, and Janine doesn't particularly like Abnegation. But while she is explaining her evil master plans, Janine says this to Triss. I have had a question since I began the Dauntless Project, and it is this. Why are most of the Divergent, weak-willed, God-fearing nobodies from Abnegation of all factions? It's that one phrase, God-fearing, that really put everything into perspective. And once you look at this book through the lens that it is a story about religious persecution, everything starts making so much more sense. But you might still be a little on the fence. Surely just referencing God doesn't make it a religious story. Well, let me go a little bit more into detail. First, let's start with Abnegation. Abnegation is the faction that values selflessness above all else, right? They help the poor, they live modestly, and they regard their elders with complete deference. These are all qualities that can be found in the Christian faith, both culturally and just directly from their teachings. Now, Abnegation is the victim of our story. They are relentlessly targeted, and by the end of the book, they are killed in the streets by those who are greedy and wish to overthrow them. And also, arguably, for their commitment to their own value of selflessness. Oh, and who are the greedy people that want to overthrow them? Erudite, the faction of knowledge and logic. They are portrayed as these cold, calculating people that have no greater purpose in life than to overthrow Abnegation. Now, with all that in mind, consider this. Erudites are actually a stand-in for atheists. In a lot of Christian media, atheists are almost always portrayed as the villains. They're cold, calculating, and are stoutly against religion because it is illogical and cannot be proven by things like science. Oftentimes, it is also science and logic itself that is also the enemy of Christianity. And that's because faith, obviously, requires you to believe in something that you can't necessarily see. You have to believe in God not because you've seen him or touched him, but because you have faith that he exists. And I'm not saying that Christians can't also believe in science or that they're inherently illogical. Science is often used as a weapon, a tool by atheists to disprove God. And as I already said, atheists are usually the villain. So those things inherently are portrayed negatively in Christian films. Not all, but a lot of them. So I need to set up that baseline so you can understand where I'm going with the rest of what I'm going to say. Again, as I've already said, abnegation in this story is the victim. So if erudite is the villain, let's go through what exactly they do in the book that makes them so heinous. The first thing they do, erudite published an article claiming that a high-up official in abnegation abused his son, and that was why he transferred out, which was true. Then, erudite publishes another article questioning why this high-up political figure had both of his children transferred to other factions, and question how good the teachings of abnegation are if his own children didn't want to stay in the faction. This is in reference to Beatrice and Caleb as they both left abnegation, right? So again, they're not lying. That's what happened. They asked a question. Is the article a little mean? Yeah. Is it opinionated? Yeah. But it's not coming from nothing. It's a valid question to be posed. That one's a little iffy, I'll give you that. But then we have erudite once again publishing an article in which they advocate for a democratic system that allows each faction to have representatives in government. Oh yeah, because I skipped this part when I read it as a kid. Abnegation is the only faction that is allowed to hold government. Their little Senate equivalent has 50 members, all from abnegation. The other 4 factions that make up their little country or whatever are allowed to have representatives and leaders, but when it comes to actually voting, they don't get a say. Like, could you imagine the Senate, for example, and instead of, 2 from every state, they all come from Alaska, and then Alaska gets mad when you say, oh, I want representatives that actually live in my state to represent me. Again, this is portrayed as like the most greedy, selfish response that erudite could have. Like, you're supposed to read it and be like, how dare they ask for representation? So yeah, them asking for a return to the democratic process is seen as negative. Then erudite also claims that abnegation is forcing their beliefs onto the other factions. They're basically saying that abnegation is forcing the other factions to live modestly by restricting their access to things like fresh food. So as far as I'm concerned, taking everything into account, erudite hasn't even lied about anything. Listen, they do some other bad things throughout the book, but in this example, I'm just examining what specifically they do that is against abnegation and like their core mission, which is a return to the democratic system. And yeah, like in the end, erudite and specifically Janine just want total control, which is kind of against her whole democratic process thing. But all I'm saying is that all the evidence we're given at the beginning for why erudite is bad doesn't seem to hold up. They seem pretty valid in their concerns. But I've talked a lot about erudite. Let's discuss abnegation, our golden boys, shall we? Let's review some of the teachings that we find from abnegation, some of the things that are normalized within the faction. At the beginning of the story, we have children are not allowed to speak at the dinner table, following into the line of thinking that children should be seen and not heard. Then we have another sad moment later on in the book in which one of the initiates, Al, commits sewer slide, and Tris has this thought about abnegation and what they think about that act. She says that the abnegation considers suicide an act of selfishness. She says something along the lines of, in abnegation, you're not supposed to think about yourself. So if you're thinking about yourself long enough to want to kill yourself, you're being selfish. Now, personally, I don't think this moment was given the absolute sheer horror that it should have been. She seems more appalled when the Dauntless leaders are praising Al and saying that he's brave for doing so, more than she is appalled at her old faction for considering the same act as selfish. This is also the point in time where I remind everyone that up until very recently, and some people still hold this belief, that committing suicide is a sin. It used to be included on the list of mortal sins. Now, thankfully, in recent years, the church is getting a little bit more progressive, so it was taken off the list. But some people still believe that. And then also, because there is more, 4 tells us that guilt is used as a tool to better themselves. Okay, so this is actually a lot worse than I made it seem when I initially recorded. So the context of Tobias bringing up guilt as a learning tool is when Al commits suicide. Tris is expressing guilt because maybe if she forgave Al or in general was nicer to him after he, again, tried to kill her, then he wouldn't have been driven to suicide. So Tobias in this moment is allowing her to blame herself for what happened to Al, despite the fact that it is absolutely not her fault. This was his own guilt for what he did, which is objectively wrong, weighing on him so much that it forced him to the edge. The exact moment in the book starts with Tris saying, "I should have forgiven him," and Tobias responds, maybe there's more we all could have done, but we just have to let the guilt remind us to do better next time. He's telling her that she should have done better by someone that literally tried to get her killed. So that was what led up to the conversation about him saying that guilt is a tool to help people do better, which is again another Christian teaching. Guilt is often used as a way to motivate people to repent or grow into a better version of themselves so that they can then live up to become better Christians. Think like confessionals, repenting for your sins, and otherwise just instilling guilt for going against the Bible, and honestly fear is unfortunately a very common practice within the Christian faith. One of the big conflicts in the book is that Erudite is accusing Abnegation of hoarding resources under the guise of giving help to the factionless. Now, helping the homeless and the needy is supposed to be a Christian virtue, which is fine, which is dandy, but in this instance, the religious undertone actually hurts the overall storytelling. Because when you read the book, you realize that the factionless are suffering. They don't have enough food, clothes, or a stable home to live in because they do not have a faction. They are victims of the system, a system that Abnegation has complete control over. So then I ask as the reader, if the factionless are still contributing members of society, if they are still active members of said society that you govern, why haven't you done more for them? Why is it that they don't have enough food or clothes or shelter? What are you as the government doing wrong? And honestly, the erudite aren't even mad at the factionless. They're not retaliating against them because in their infinite wisdom, because, they pursue knowledge and whatnot, they know that the issue here is not the factionless, but Abnegation, because they're the ones that are in control. Theoretically, they have no opposition. They're all from the same faction. Why is it that the factionless are such an issue that they need to be pouring resources into them? Because the factionless are supposed to be working the essential jobs. They're manning the public transit. They're doing waste management. So my question then, why are they not paid enough? Because they're getting paid by the government, Abnegation, mind you. Why aren't they getting paid enough to afford food, clothes, and shelter? It seems like Abnegation is going wrong somewhere, right? Which again, just reinforces to me that erudite is valid in criticizing them, which ties in to the overall issue with the religious undertones in Divergent. Abnegation is portrayed as the victim, relentlessly persecuted by the other factions, when in reality, they hold total and absolute power over their society. It's the same way that some Christians feel that they are constantly under attack in a system that is designed to side with them. That good old freedom of religion has protected so many Christians and allowed them to make decisions on women's bodies, determine if they can serve people just because they identify as gay. It's the reason Chick-fil-A can stay closed on Sunday. And yet, they will still claim that they are being persecuted by the masses when in reality, they hold so much power. It's an oxymoron, which kind of sums up the entire book. And honestly, it kind of backfires. Me being able to recognize that Abnegation is in a position of power makes me side with Erudite. It makes me understand why they are so frustrated with the current government. I feel like I'm reading about the American Revolution from the perspective of King George, because Triss is so adamant that Erudite is bad, but every single time we hear from other people about why Erudite is upset with abnegation, I'm like, you're valid. So the underlying and maybe unintentional message of the book is that abnegation is facing persecution because of their beliefs. It is made abundantly clear that abnegation is different from the other factions, and in a way, better. They tell us in the book that most divergents are coming from abnegation. And because our main character is divergent, we're meant to think that divergence is good. Because divergents are more likely to hold all 5 virtues. They're not only kind, or only selfless, or only brave. But everyone else, the other factions that don't really have divergence, are below them because they can only experience one of the 5 virtues. Again, just further trying to show that abnegation is somehow special. They're the chosen ones. The religious ideology bleeds very heavily into the book, and in this instance, it's what hurts it the most. Because while this could have been a dystopian novel that just so happened to have some religious undertones, it actually just turns into Christians are always the victim and constantly being persecuted. Triss never questions the faction system. She never disagrees with abnegation being in power. She fully believes that the system is fine. It's working as intended. She believes that the abnegation should be the only ones in power and that the erudite are simply being greedy. She refuses to hear out literally anyone that has anything bad to say about abnegation. Mind you, a faction that she didn't even want to stay in. Abnegation as a faction is never portrayed in any kind of bad light. Their bad trait is that they're a little dull. Erudite, Candor, even Dauntless all have characters that have bad qualities. Triss has something negative to say about all the other factions and not abnegation. The only negative thing we hear about abnegation is all from Marcus. And even though that's the faction he's from, he's completely disconnected with their teachings. He's mostly portrayed as just an anomaly and almost like he doesn't reflect abnegation as a whole. And yet you have characters like Eric and Janine who are seen as antagonists. They're inherently aggressive and violent, and yet somehow for them, they reflect their entire factions, which is another big reason that a lot of Christian media falls flat, is that oftentimes they don't want to criticize their own religion. Which, I mean, no one really wants to criticize themselves or portray themselves in a negative light. But in storytelling, you need a healthy balance of both. That's what makes characters three-dimensional, and that's what makes a story interesting. For a character, or in this case, a system, to have flaws is crucial. But in this instance, I think the religious ideology is what hurts the story, because the book refuses to criticize Christianity and therefore cannot criticize abnegation. So even when abnegation is acting in a way that is contradictory to their own values, it is not called out in the book. For a faction that prides itself on its selflessness, isn't it a little selfish to not share political power with the other factions? Isn't it a little selfish to demand that the dinner table only be reserved for adults to talk? Isn't it selfish to demand that an entire society of people conform to your way of thinking? Every single criticism Triss throws at Erudite can be thrown right back to abnegation, and yet this contradiction is never explored. Now, I don't think this book was made intentionally to be religious, but everyone kind of agrees that that's in the undertones. The author, Veronica Roth, is a proud Christian. In the acknowledgments of Divergent, she even thanked God in the first line. So this is not a secret, and in this instance, when reading the book, you can see where a lot of her inspiration came from. And honestly, I think this book really could have been strong, even with the inclusion of religious themes and messages. But what really hurts it is that abnegation, our stand-in for Christianity, is never criticized. The villain of our story is one singular person and not the system, which kind of goes against what a dystopian novel is. I mean, the whole theme of the Hunger Games is that it's not just one person that is responsible for the district's suffering. It's the games themselves and the people that uphold that system. The enemy of the Hunger Games is not the other tribute that you're going up against. It's the system that puts you in the arena. And that's kind of the consensus with all dystopian novels, because dystopia is meant to be a critique on real-world systems of injustice. So in this this book by making Janine our primary antagonist, it again reinforces to the reader that the system is working just fine. Abnegation should be the only ones in power. The problem here is Janine and Erudite because they are greedy and they are selfish. Even when Triss herself is persecuted for having more than one character trait, she finds nothing wrong with people getting divided up into factions. There's a big moment in the book where she's talking to Tobias and he says, "We got it wrong. People shouldn't be divided into factions. We should feel all those emotions." He says, "I want to be brave and selfless and kind and honest and smart." And that's supposed to be the big thing in the book, that the factions are just keeping people divided, but they should all be free to express themselves and have diverse ways of thinking. But is the enemy the faction system? No, it's only Erudite, and it's only Janine, which again, they are our stand-ins for atheism. So unfortunately, I do think it is these religious undertones, and rather the refusal to critique religion, that make this book fall flat. It really sums up a lot of the issues I have with this book, but trust me, it's not the only one. Now, I covered a lot in that little religious spiel, but now I'm going to go a little bit more into the world building aspect. It really does tie in a lot of my criticisms because unfortunately, I do think it also holds the book back. There is a point in the story in which they're talking about the factions and that the reason that they were created is because groups of people were essentially like, this is the reason that we think war happens. The people that thought it was selfishness created abnegation. The people that thought it was dishonesty created candor, and so on and so forth. And I was really excited when I read that part because I thought, oh my God, we are going to get this in-depth commentary on war and human nature and why war happens. But then it never comes up again. The problem is that the story is still entertaining. I feel like a lot of books nowadays that come out that like don't have great world building, or the plot is really slow, or it's just a lot of romance and we really distract from what the overall story is supposed to be about, they're still like written bad. This book, the plot is so bad in terms of the progression. Like the main focus of the story is supposed to be Triss overthrowing her government, or in this instance, overthrowing Janine and fighting against her or whatever. And we forget that so frequently. There are times throughout the story where Triss is like doing nothing, and then all of a sudden it's like she remembers that she's supposed to be girl bossing, and stuff just gets thrown in at the last second. There's a moment where she's at Erudite headquarters meeting up with Caleb, and they're like having an argument, and then literally at the last second before she leaves, she's like, by the way, you're supposed to research the serum because mom told me to ask you to do that. This is very, very important information that she's supposed to have about the serums and how they work. Her telling Caleb to research it is entirely necessary for the plot to continue. And it's an afterthought. There's this moment later on in the cafeteria when she's officially in Dauntless. She is celebrating with her friends. She kisses Tobias. It's this whole moment. It's crazy. It's chaotic. And then out of nowhere, no rhyme or reason, literally thrown in there, Triss, for some reason, thinks to herself, oh my God, the simulation serums have transmitters in them. Erudite is going to control our minds. Nothing prompted this revelation that she had. It literally just clicks from nothing. So really the whole girl boss overthrowing the government, you know, the main thing that qualifies a dystopian novel, is an afterthought to the main plot of the story, which is Triss going through initiation and hitting on her teacher. So the dystopia part of the novel being an afterthought is crazy. And normally I would be up in arms about it. But also what I realized as I was going through the story is that it's still interesting. Like the world building, a lot of the aspects of the story are bad, but objectively, the pacing, the writing, it's still entertaining. And you know, that's not weird. Sometimes things are bad, but they're entertaining. Like reality TV. Is it good quality? No. Does it contribute to society? No. But damn it, I'm gonna grab my popcorn and watch. That's kind of like Divergent. Is the story really that good? No, not from a literary standpoint, not from a logical standpoint, but it's interesting. It's entertaining to read. And maybe it's residuals from my childhood nostalgia, but for all I'm gonna say about the book, the pacing is good. The scenes, the tension, all that is good. And for all my praise, the stakes and tension are not always great, because the biggest conflict in the story is that Tris cannot let anyone find out that she is divergent, and at the same time does everything in her ability to show people that she is divergent. So at the beginning of the story, it's not really a huge issue for her. She just kind of goes about her day, but it really becomes a problem when she starts doing the simulations, because since she's divergent, she knows when she's in a simulation and can manipulate it and break it. Now, in the Divergent movie, and this feels blasphemous to say, but I think they did a better job of handling the simulations. In the movie, Tobias teaches Tris how to go through her fears without breaking the simulation. He essentially teaches her how to think like a dauntless. For example, there's one scene where they're on a ledge and she's like, oh, well, the simulation's not real. We should just jump off from this building. And Tobias tells her that's what a divergent would do, but a dauntless would not.
If you want to pass, if you want to avoid discovery, you have to do everything the way a dauntless would do it.
So they go through all the fears with this same mindset that she has to think it through logically. But in her final evaluation, where everyone is watching her, she breaks every single simulation. There's a moment where she's being attacked by crows and she literally manifests a gun. Then she's trapped in that little glass case where it fills up with water and she shatters the glass. It is moment after moment of her creating solutions for herself, things that the other initiates can't do, and no one questions her about it. Janine herself is literally watching Tris go through her fear landscape and questions nothing. And they already previously established when she was going through the simulations with Tobias and he says, hey, how did you do that? Why are you breaking the simulation? This is a common trait amongst the Divergents. So her doing the same exact thing in her fear landscape with people watching her do it should have immediately set off red flags. She should have immediately gone into custody. But no one flags this as weird, not even Janine, who is supposed to be on the hunt for divergence. So in that instance, she's really not in any danger. She's in more danger with the other initiates for just existing than she is as a divergent. Now moving on to the characters, starting with our protagonist, Tris. Honestly, she's okay. I think I have a little bit more of an appreciation for her as an adult than I did as a child. And it's mainly because she's not a really good person. She constantly has conflicting feelings where in moments that she sees people in distress, her first instinct is not to help them. And I thought it was a really interesting dynamic for her to kind of have that internal struggle where she doesn't think that she's a selfless person. But then you have Tobias, her love interest, who is putting into perspective for her that the times that she is bravest is when she's being selfless. There's a lot of nuance to her character, and I think almost a little too much of it is in the undertones. Some revelations of herself could be a little bit more overt, but I do like what they did with her character, especially her arc from being seen as this poor, defenseless, tiny girl to someone who is incredibly strong and powerful. And yeah, maybe does have a little bit too much pride. And yeah, can be a little too aggressive. But she's someone that can hold her own in a fight. And seeing her come to the realization that certain people want her to stay that petite little abnegation girl versus someone who is actually strong is really interesting to read. I also really like Al's character. He's this super huge dude. I think he's from Candor. And there's a really nice conversation to be had about his character because he really represents the nice guy. He has this huge crush on Tris, but he only likes her when she's being this shy abnegation girl and someone that he needs to protect. And he starts showing aggression and anger to her the minute that she starts excelling and showing strength. Now, as for the rest of the characters, the only person I really want to bring up is Tobias. Now, Theo James, you have a special place in my heart. Respectfully and not in a creepy way. It really hurts my heart because I imagine his face whenever I think of Tobias. They are one and the same to me. However, with that being said, Tobias is a creepy weirdo. So the one thing, and I don't know if everyone remembers, but there is an age gap between Tris and Tobias. He's 18 and she's 16, which is already a little weird, a little suspicious. But it's explicitly mentioned in the book where Tris is like, you know, you're so much older than me and you're like probably more experienced than I am. Like, this is weird. And Tobias is so flippant about it. He literally says something like, oh my God, Tris, yeah, 2 years. It's such a huge age gap. I'm such a grandpa compared to you. And he says this in response to her genuinely asking, aren't I too young for you? Now, is 2 years really a huge age gap? It depends on the context. But what I think is really being looked over in this situation is that Tobias is not only 2 years older than her, he's her teacher. He is in a direct position of power. He can alter her future in Dauntless forever. He can alter her rankings to make sure that she doesn't pass initiation and becomes factionless. And he just like refuses to acknowledge that when he's talking about a romantic relationship with her. Not to mention that she is at an incredibly vulnerable part in her life. She's away from her family, everything she's ever known. She's in a new place where people hate her, and her future is riding on her making it through initiation. She's at a very vulnerable part in her life. So this just really gave me the ick. And again, this is like me as an adult looking back, because when I was a teenager reading this, I loved Tobias. I was like, oh my God, if I could just find me a man like Tobias Eaton, now I would run from a man like Tobias Eaton. Also, his dynamic with Tris is just very weird. Tris really doesn't like being seen as weak, and he's like, no, I don't see you like that. But he kind of takes the extreme where there's a point in the book that he says, when I look at you, my first instinct is to break you. He says, I want to break you just to see how hard I would have to push. And it's also crazy to say because he is the survivor of abuse. And he's talking about, I want to break you. And then when they have their cute little like romantic night together and she wakes up the next morning and he is like super cold to her and just like berates her, he apologizes by saying, I'm sorry. I forget that I can hurt you. I forget that you're capable of being hurt. You either die the hero or live long enough to see your fictional boyfriends turn into monsters. Now, for the last part of this video, I'm going to discuss whether or not Divergent can actually be classified as a YA dystopian novel, which in my opinion, I don't think it can. Dystopia as a genre is meant to be a critique on our greater, real human society. Yes, certain things are exaggerated, heightened, and it's not a one-for-one comparison. And of course, there is a mixture of fictional elements, but the core message can be applied to our real-life world. Common themes in the dystopia genre include corruption, inequality, and injustice. There's usually a greater commentary on things like human nature, societal norms, and what we deem as right and wrong. Typically, the villains in these stories will be things like the government or other systems of injustice that strip people of their freedom and power, which yes, we do have that in Divergent, but again, there is never a critique on the faction system. This system that keeps people divided literally into 5 different factions and doesn't allow them to stray from the norm that is associated with each faction. If you as an abnegation also enjoy reading and growing your knowledge, that is not acceptable. The virtues of each faction are so restrictive that it even carries over into their own clothing choices. There's literally a line in the book that says that the Kandor wear black and white because that's how they see the world. And there is a slight commentary on why this isn't exactly fair to everyone, because Tris herself says that when she's out and about in public, interacting with people from other factions, she finds herself fulfilling this caricature of what her faction is supposed to be. It's only when she's in the comfort of her own faction, amongst her own people, that she can be a little more laid back. They can joke around with each other, and in general, they just act more human. At the beginning of the book, when Tris is trying to figure out what faction she wants to go into, she struggles because she doesn't think that she is abnegation enough. The restrictiveness of the faction system literally causes an identity crisis. And yet, There is no problem with the factions. By the end of the book, Triss isn't like, oh, we should get rid of the factions and allow people to just live freely and choose their own emotions as they see fit. No, again, the villain of the story is erudite only. Janine only. The critique in this book is, yes, against people that are greedy for power specifically. But in this instance, we only see that greed impacting abnegation. You can also argue that, yes, Dauntless is affected because they are forced to act as Janine's personal army, but her pursuit of power is specifically to go against abnegation, which is, yes, still wrong. I'm not trying to say that erudite is in any way right in their actions. Like, the critique on Janine's greed for power seems more rooted in, well, greed is one of the 7 deadly sins and is therefore wrong, versus the actual corruption that plays into that greed and need for power. Like, they allude to something greater of like, oh, Janine just wants everyone to think like her and she's restricting people from having their own opinions. But really the main focus is just erudite versus abnegation, which keeps the world very, very small when it has the potential to be something so much bigger. Again, just kind of tying back into that whole Divergent is actually a story about religious persecution, but I already went through that spiel. I would say it probably better qualifies as just plain old young adult fiction, because you could really argue that the divergence in the factions is just like an allegory for the transitional phase that teenagers go through, which is really what makes young adult as a genre. The things that are tackled in books that are directed at young adults are things that concern them. Themes of identity, transition, change, and just the fears that are associated with those things are commonly found in these kinds of books. So Triss being conflicted about which faction she belongs in, her struggling against her own emotions and trying to be a good person are all things that directly relate to young adults. So I would say it's more of an allegory for the identity crisis that so many people go through when they're transitioning into adulthood, and just the struggle of trying to figure out who you are. Now, it is exaggerated, it is heightened, and it does include some aspects of dystopian literature, but I think it's still a little bit of a stretch to actually qualify it as dystopian. I would also argue that since our main character doesn't have any critiques about the flaws of the faction system, that there is therefore no greater commentary on what it says about our real life society. Like, I read Divergent, and I'm getting the greed aspect of it, but there's just really nothing that I can directly compare it to. Like, you read The Hunger Games, you find out Reaping Day is July 4th, they say things like, remember who the real enemy is, and you know what she's trying to say. You know who she's talking about. In Divergent, not so much. Overall, I would say that Divergent has fallen out of favor for good reason. While at the time of its publication, it did cater to a lot of that need and desire for more dystopian fiction, nowadays, when you look back on it, it wasn't that great. Now again, it's an entertaining read, I have to admit that. But now as an adult with a greater appreciation for dystopian as a genre, I realize that it just doesn't hold up. Now knowing the real societal implications and how these books can really open people's eyes to what's happening to them, you read books like Divergent and it just doesn't hold the same weight. In theory, the world of Divergent is exciting and interesting, but in execution, not so much. There is a lack of introspection, a lack of considering what exactly the message of this book was supposed to be. And while we can still hold a special place in our hearts for the books and the movies, I think we can still have a productive conversation and critique of what the original series was. And again, the purpose of this video is not to say that Christianity is bad or that Christian media is inherently bad, but rather to critique how it was flawed in the execution of this book specifically. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know what you think of this video, if you agree, disagree, if you have any insights, or in general, if you just have anything to add. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. But with that, I think that's the end of the video. I have reread this book too many times to count. Now, I do have a lot of notes, a lot of critiques, and if you can believe it, this video didn't even cover everything that I wanted to say. Anytime I went on a new point or a new tangent, it just kind of went back to the whole Christianity thing. And I was like, you know what? There's only so many times I can really drive that point home. I think we're clear. So I tried to be as succinct as possible. I didn't want to be too nitpicky because, again, who am I? I'm just a girl with a microphone and a lot of opinions. But you know what I also am? a soon-to-be published author. Yes, you heard that right. I am coming out with a book series. Yep, you heard me right. I am actually coming out with a middle grade series called The Magical Morrisons. So if you like things like magic, witches, family shenanigans, and of course Hispanic representation, I suggest you check out my book series. You can check out my description. I will put links to pre-order all 4 books, yes, it's 4, which are set to come out in January of 2026. So I would greatly appreciate it if you guys check those out. And of course, if you want to order them, you don't have to, but that would be really cool as well. Another way you can support me is of course by subscribing and liking this video. You can also follow me on all my social media at Listen to Kristen on TikTok, Instagram, and BlueSky. You can also follow my reviews on Goodreads, and I mean, while you're on the site, you should also add my books to your want to read list. Anyway, enough self-indulgent promo. Thank you so much for watching the video, and I will see you in the next one. In the next video, hopefully if everything goes according to schedule, I will be reviewing The Maze Runner, so be on the lookout for that. Don't forget to check out The Magical Morrisons. More information to come. Thank you.